case. And fingers crossed, this is going to work.
Yes, we can see your screen.
Great. And can you hear me, Professor Mohammed?
Yes, loud and clear.
Perfect. So, salam alaikum, and thank you everyone for making the time during football season to come to this seminar. It's my great pleasure to come and present to you tonight my time, this afternoon your time, for my dear friend Professor Mohammed, who has visited me here in Melbourne, Australia, which at the moment is unseasonably very, very cold. So everyone here is trying to protect themselves against a winter which has gone on for 2 months longer than it should have. So if I start to shiver during my presentation, you'll understand why. And I just want to, well, I'm just going to skip my brief bio because I think that Professor Mohammed covered that off wonderfully, except to say that what I really want to present today is exactly as Professor Mohammed said, you know, some thoughts really about policy and how policy can inform our cyber response and control it. And really that's through the lens both as a researcher as well as a consultant. So I do a lot of cyber consulting for government and private sector and charity organisations here in Australia in the cyberspace. And so I really want to try and share my insights and hopefully at the end of the presentation, if time permits, we can have a broader discussion about some of these issues, because I think the interesting thing, of course, is that the issues that we face here in Australia, that you have faced in Saudi, in some ways, they're quite common. You know, we are all facing this particular threat from malware and data breaches, and I'll talk briefly about some of the more infamous ones that have occurred in Australia recently, which may not have made the news there, but I think have a lot of parallels in the past with attacks, say, on Saudi Aramco. And, you know, so if I just begin and kind of step back and say, well, what at the end of the day is a national security issue versus, say, seeing cyber purely through an ICT lens. So if you look at the 7 dimensions of national security, you know, this ranges from everything from economic security through to physical security through to cyber security. And you might say, well, what has cyber got to do with food security? Like, clearly it's linked to physical, cyber and economic security, as I'll discuss more in this presentation. But, you know, I just looked through some news reports earlier of a milk production company that was targeted with ransomware. So, you know, kind of withholding food from the population because the milk processor has been held to ransom is clearly a threat to national security. And I think across all 7 of these dimensions, at the moment, most countries in the world are suffering a greatly increased incidence of these kinds of scenarios. And so I think what I'd like to really float out there is that, you know, when it gets to this level, a nationally coordinated response is required. Personally, I'm not convinced that many governments have taken courageous or very direct policy decisions. There's certainly been some direct policy decisions in the past, like, I don't know, let's switch the internet off for 24 hours. Now, you know, that seems very, very drastic, but when you are dealing with a clear and present danger, sometimes switching something off might well be the rational response. So to kind of illustrate and provide a background to my thinking here around national security, I'm going to pick up 2 of these topics, 2 of these dimensions. So specifically economic security and cyber security. And I'm going to talk about 2 studies that I was involved with in the last couple of years, both looking at the relationship between intellectual property on the internet and piracy and the I guess, going threat hunting, which in fact is not very difficult in this field because there's so much malware out there, and to really try and look at the nexus between people who are inflicting economic damage as well as installing the malware. Okay, and primarily that's often done through advertising, but there are other vectors. And so I'm going to show you some examples. I did have a video prepared, but I think when I reviewed it, I thought perhaps it might not be suitable for this audience just based on the content. And so I want to then wrap up at the end by kind of setting out some elements of a national security agenda for cybersecurity. Okay, so this is a real example of an incident. In fact, this is a bit of fake malware or malware that's just not very good because you can disable it and bypass it. But actually, it's a very clever one because it came about after me going onto a piracy site and searching for some content for about 30 seconds. And of course, you get this screen flash up, your computer gets locked, and it says, look, you just need to ring this Microsoft support number, and it is a real number, local number here in Australia. You ring the number and, of course, you get connected to a tech support person who says, look, you've just got to download this piece of software so we can take control of your system, and look, we'll update some device drivers, or we'll install some AV that's going to protect you in the future. And by the way, it might cost you, I don't know, $50, or maybe it's free. And really, by the time you install that software, perhaps with a local administrator account, you are well and truly owned. And you know, this is a really, really simple example of how malware can really trap people so easily. We've had 2 major data breaches in Australia in recent weeks. So in one case, Medibank Australia, which holds the personal data of about 10 million customers, including myself. Unfortunately, I left this company as a policyholder 13 years ago, but unfortunately they still held my details, and for some reason only explicable to them, that data was still internet facing 13 years on after me leaving. So that's a really good example of where something like policy can be a weakness as well as a weapon, because I think in both of these cases, Medibank and Optus, the organisations argued that government policy required them to retain all of this data. And so maybe it's smart now to look at some of the older protections and policies around cyber and say, are they really fit for purpose in the 21st century? In Australia, we have a GDPR-like Privacy Act, which was first envisaged in 1988. And so in 1988, we actually didn't have commercial internet in Australia. So it's clear that regulation over the years probably hasn't caught up. Having said that, we do have a new regime in Australia called the Security of Critical Infrastructure regime, which has so far been acted in 2 parts, which are called SOCI and SLACIT. Just because I think governments like acronyms. And basically it says, look, if you operate critical infrastructure in Australia, the definition of which is very, very broad, then you must report cyber incidents within a very short time frame. And over time, you must adopt and assess yourself against one of a number of different industry standards. So the ISO 27001 or the NIST framework, or in Australia, we have the Essential 8 control set. Basically, these are the kinds of things that government is going to impose here across most sectors, because at the end of the day, most sectors of the economy are actually essential. It's really hard to begin to say, well, of course we need hospitals, but could we do without banks, for example? So despite, these well-publicized data breaches, my impression is that in the current economic climate where we have lots of inflation, where the economy is really bouncing back after COVID, where revenue in some cases is still recovering, that, many companies are aggressively putting controls on costs, and that includes spending on cybersecurity. Some modelling I did recently, and you can look at the INI's blog to see this, I think estimated that the cyber spend that we would predict for a medium-sized company is probably in the order of about $178,000 a year. Now, a typical experienced cyber analyst, just one person in Australia, would cost about $150,000, with the on-costs that would exceed the annual projected budget. So you can see that even for a relatively large company, investment in cyber, once you take that as a proportion of the IT budget, which itself is then a proportion of the overall budget, there's often just not a lot of money around. The other big issue, I think, is that in many cases, our elected officials who create policy about cyber actually have no cyber training or education. And I mean, I'm not saying that they're not educated and that they're not clever, but, it's really hard to land in something like a cyber portfolio and to try and make sense of the kind of historical backdrop and, even things like standards and frameworks, which are really complex. It takes a long time to get up to speed, but, it's a bit like jumping into the driver's seat on a moving train. And this is something I think that governments around the world really need to address very, very quickly. And I think the other kind of issue is it's hard to justify spending on cyber, even government spending, which is often quite minimal, without having quantitative risk data. And so one of the products I created a few years ago was called the 100-point cyber check. And the idea behind it was to really try and gather data about actual cyber practices in industry, and then to try and map out a national journey towards maturity. We're certainly not there yet. I think we've only had about 100 people come through, 100 organisations, which has been great. I think it provides insights, but we certainly have a long way to go. So you might ask, what, in a broader sense, what is the purpose of malware? And I do kind of come and talk about what malware is in a minute. But, at the end of the day, malware authors are really after one of two things. They're either after money or they're after information. So Medibank data breach, Optus data breach was all about information, but the possession and ransoming of that information simply had a financial kind of motivation. And I think that's the case. I mean, this is just classic cybercrime stuff, right? But I think that one of the things that is sometimes forgotten is that people, these organizations, just like a diversified industrial, they get revenue from a whole lot of things. So whether it's child exploitation material, whether it's ripping off intellectual property, whether it's holding data at ransom, they're quite innovative in getting out there and trying to find different ways to maximize this revenue. So in the example I'm going to show today, I'm going to look at some audiovisual piracy sites. These have a very significant impact on the creative economy. They reduce investment in new movies and new music. They directly impact revenue for companies that are owned by pension funds, and the kind of downstream economic damage is pretty bad. If someone releases a movie and it makes $100 million less revenue, that's probably $25 million less that goes into hospitals and schools for that year. So, but the risk is high. The data that I've seen suggests that, around 357 million people visit a piracy site every day. And so that level of traffic makes these sites, just by the sheer volume of visitors, makes them very, very attractive to cyber gangs. And I think one of the things, and I'll show you some examples shortly, but I mean, advertising fraud itself online also costs legitimate businesses money, because they're spending money to buy advertising space. The ad network reports back that the ad was displayed, but if you've got some malware in your browser, which is then doing a redirect to a different fake advertising network, then A, you get a malware infection, and B, the advertiser pays for something that they didn't then receive. So, you know, and honestly, once that malware is in your browser, for example, and it's reading credit card numbers that are being retrieved, it's looking at data that you're entering into forms. You know, if you're getting malware that's installed directly in the operating system and it opens up a remote access Trojan, if that's then linked to a corporate network, lots of people working at home these days over a VPN, then that kind of lateral movement is also what some of these attackers are looking for. So malware, I think everybody knows what malware is here, but, you know, I think the main point I want to make is to kind of come back to those motivations. So some malware authors are kind of nation states looking for information. Some are just amateurs looking for curiosity. But, you know, my gut feeling and looking at and I guess spending a lot of time looking at that kind of malware universe, and looking at where the threats actually are, I really do believe that most of the motivation is actually now for money. So, you know, and I guess the other issue for businesses is, you know, you lose money directly through something like a ransom, for example, but then doing the cleanup later on. I mean, you know, there was a great Forrester and Hiscox report, you know, basically for European businesses, I mean, just cleaning up afterwards is an average 50,000 euros. So it really is a quite a significant potential cost for business. So, you know, why do people get involved in this business? Well, you know, you can download a kit today. You can pay someone peanuts to run and target attacks for you. You know, it is so easy. You can sit in your country, attack people in another country. If there's no extradition treaty, then you're not going to get arrested. The likelihood of getting detected in the first place is really, really low. If you successfully ransom a big company, you can get millions. So, you know, this kind of business just keeps on giving and giving. It is really hard to kind of see a way that it's not going to be successful. So this is the challenge that governments are facing from a policy point of view. And of course, you know, the two really big cases in the US, I mean, I'll just talk about them briefly, particularly the attack vectors. So, you know, the JBS case, there was a very short period of reconnaissance, a data breach, 45 gigs of data, very targeted data download over 3 months, then a data breach, and then a ransomware attack. And eventually there was a ransom paid. Colonial Pipeline, again, someone had reused a password that was then the same as what was on a VPN. And, you know, this resulted in, you know, quite serious threats to national security. I mean, there was no gas for a long time, huge amount of data, again, breached, and then again, a ransomware attack. A ransom was paid in Bitcoin, later recovered by the FBI, because despite what people think, I mean, you know, things like cryptocurrencies are not entirely anonymous. So that was a really good piece of work by the FBI. So, you know, where does malware come from? Basically, you know, people jumping onto what, you know, Komodo call shady websites, clicking on ads, installing games and software, which is obviously full of malware. You know, things like phishing emails, torrent downloads, and so on. So often, you know, I think the pattern that we see is users are kind of promised something which is then not delivered. And it's something really juicy and enticing, like free software, free music, free movies, install a device driver, and people just do silly things. but it's interesting. I mean, I did some research with the Asia Video Industry Association a couple of years ago, and we did an attitudinal study. And, you know, it was really interesting kind of asking ordinary users where they thought malware came from. And, you know, about 31% around Asia Pacific correctly linked it to visiting piracy sites and piracy apps. And it was interesting that, you know, that where that level of awareness was high in a country, that the corresponding malware infection rates were actually lower. So that kind of awareness and training and education is not just critical for government ministers, it's really critical for consumers as well. I then did a little empirical study in Asia, and again did one in Europe, again just looking at these sites and, you know, getting infected, obviously in a whole lot of virtual machines. And look, it's interesting. I mean, I think, you know, compared to Europe, Asia has relatively few cyber policies and protections. But in Europe, you know, there's the GDPR, the Cybersecurity Act, NISA, NIS Directive, and so on. You know, to be honest, my impression is it doesn't do a heck of a lot to actually stop malware. So I think we need to go back to the drawing board to really understand how this stuff can be prevented. But I thought what I'd do to kind of illustrate and make this a little bit real is to show some of the, you know, screenshots and kind of categories and mechanisms by which malware spreads on these sites. So typically what I do in these kind of empirical studies is I simulate a user, and, you know, sometimes the method changes, but, you know, basically I kind of click through what a typical user would do. If I get a notification saying, hey, install this device driver, I click it. If I get an ad, I click it. I allow pop-ups. I basically do all the things as a cyber expert that I know I shouldn't do, but that are the things that ordinary users typically do. And then, you know, I mean, before I start all that, I switch off antivirus, and then later on I switch it back on. I look at the malware samples that are downloaded. I make use of sites like VirusTotal and Joe Sandbox to look at what the malware actually does. You know, you can map that activity to things like the MITRE attack framework to understand the purpose of the malware. And you can also run the malware and then obviously yourself observe the network traffic. What are the endpoints? What are the command and control servers that the malware is actually talking to? So this is a pretty typical kind of example. You know, you start by going to something like Pirate Bay, you click on an ad and it says, hey, install this VPN, and you just kind of trust that you're installing a software from some place you've never heard of before, and Bob's your uncle. Sometimes you might get a pop-up which appears in the middle, and it gives you a link to a site, and I'm guessing this site really doesn't have much to do with free cosmetics, that in fact it is going to lead you to some malware. And here's another example, again, where they've created a fake domain with 3 random words, got a key in there, and basically when you run this through something like Joe Sandbox, you can see that it's trying to show you some adult show to entice you into looking at it, but basically it's full of malicious activity. So in that example there, you know, it was Dopplik AA, and again, this is one of the malvertising fraud kind of systems. And so, you know, basically once that gets into your system, you will only see malicious advertising from then on. Every time you see a legitimate ad block, the malware will replace it. Here's a great example of a pop-up where, you know, again, you've gone to look at the, I think that actually may well be a streaming football site, by the way. And it says, hey, you know, want to show you notifications. You click that, and again, you get access to malware. Sometimes, though, you get false positives. So in this example, this is a malware vendor who is showing you in your browser screen claiming that you've been infected when in fact you haven't been. Because as much as the crooks know that, you know, people go to piracy sites and get infected, so do the malware, the anti-malware companies. And so this is one of the kind of tactics that they use. And I'm kind of not saying that, you know, that it's bad, because the consequence is good if people buy and install antivirus software, but it is a little bit underhanded, I've got to be honest and say. Here's an example. Again, you're watching a streaming movie and it says, hey, to watch the movie, you need to install this extension. Absolutely certain that that extension is not going to be something positive for you. Similar example here, in this case, you are asked to install a Wikipedia encyclopedia as part of accessing the site. And of course, that is actually malware. So if I look at things that actually work quite well in terms of policy when I've done this before. So, you know, sometimes there are third-party verification services that are out there looking for malicious activity in ad networks. So you might get a warning. Sometimes Google Chrome throws up a warning if there's issues with certificates, for example. Sometimes if you're using Android, it will say, hey, you're trying to install something which might be malicious. So it's not that there are no protections out there, but I've got to say, having gone through thousands of these things over the years, the protections are not actually perfect. So in another case, I looked at some known piracy applications and on Android. So this was a mobile device and basically used the same kind of approach, but then actually did something a little bit different. I took the code and I uploaded the 33 apps to VirusTotal, which allows you to check for malware across 70 different AV scanners. And, you know, basically out of those 33 apps, I mean, I found 19 distinct malware samples across the whole set. So the odds are, if you install an Android piracy app, that more than likely you are going to get a malware infection. So I thought that was a pretty good result. If anybody's a gambler, 57% is not bad. Again, some other kind of examples. This was a really interesting one, MobiDash. So in this case, the user gets bombarded with pop-up ads, but cleverly it goes into stealth mode for 3 days after installation. So in fact, you know, you download the app, you watch some pirated movies, and then you forget about it. And of course, what you don't think down the track is that it's going to keep kind of showing stuff to you. And so certainly according to Kaspersky, this is really within the top 10 for Europe. You know, it can propagate, attach itself to other applications. It's really hard to get removed. The other really sneaky thing, thinking back to the MITRE ATT&CK framework, that I saw was at least one Android app which had a Windows payload. So it was essentially capable of that payload being deployed into a Windows network from an Android device. So that kind of shows the level of technical sophistication. So, you know, a user sees an app which is something free, but in fact, what's sitting behind that is something that's really, really significant. So, you know, here's another kind of example of, you know, play protect and other things that basically warning users. But, you know, I'm guessing most users are going to install anyway if they see that they're going to get a free kind of product. So, you know, if I break that down and kind of analyze, you know, the different actions that can lead to consequences, you know, it's kind of clicking links, clicking banner ads, the cost per click malware and adware, browser notifications, and then installing full applications. And all of these things ultimately can lead to lateral movement or identity theft or criminal revenue. So, you know, really in summary, and this is just looking at, you know, a really small aspect of cyber, but, you know, a government policy needs to deal with specifically attack vectors of these kinds and not more general kinds of issues. So again, when I looked at some European sites, again, kind of the Microsoft one that I showed earlier, there wasn't much in terms of a time difference. I mean, I think Asia, the typical kind of compromise happens in less than a minute. In Europe, it was slightly more. I'm not sure that's something to be particularly proud of. It's really clear around the world that there is a really serious kind of issue. So, where do we kind of go from here? If I look at this from a policy point of view, it's really clear to me that, either governments don't look in detail enough at the ways that consumers get infected by malware. And, by that, I mean, sitting on the edge of the national network and really understanding the data that you're seeing. I mean, my impression is that unless you're in the Great Wall of, the Great Firewall of China, there doesn't seem to be that kind of level of national enforcement of policy, even if you had good policies in the first place. So, part of it, is looking at the traffic and understanding who's benefiting from traffic. And part of that is looking at the business model and understanding how people monetize this kind of criminal activity. And, once you've identified the criminal activity and how it works, then you can look at the role of intermediaries. You can look at people who provide payment services to cyber criminals. Well, come up with a policy that can basically take enforcement action against them and shut them down if they continue to kind of breach the law. The role of domain registrars, the role of ICANN, the role of, who is, which, I did a study back in 2013 and, I mean, who is data in most cases is either complete science fiction or you have criminals sitting behind privacy protection. And so again, at a government to government level, we really need to, I guess, compare the privacy that organisations can get through privacy protection and registration versus things like corporate databases and corporate information, which is generally quite public in most countries. So why do we have domain registration data that's been private, whereas company domain or company information more broadly is actually public? And it's public for good reason, because we need that transparency. We need the accountability. At the moment, if a consumer gets infected, they really have no recourse. There's very few ways for them to kind of either recover funds, particularly if they're scammed and, they authorise transactions that they shouldn't, then, banks are generally perhaps less sympathetic in that case. Other kind of national level reforms, so things like regulatory site blocking has been used a lot in many, many jurisdictions. It's a great strategy, but it does suffer from whack-a-mole. So you shut down, you go to the court, you get a site blocked one day, the site operator simply starts up a new site the next day. So that's the problem with these groups. They're well organised and they're well funded. I think looking at consumer protections is really important, as I mentioned. Maybe it's things like providing endpoint protection nationally so that every consumer device in the country is protected by an endpoint protection software. It's going to cost money, but look at the downstream impact if you're able to prevent widespread malware infection. Military response, I see this raised from time to time. I guess once you have open cyber warfare on the internet, we can probably kiss goodbye to the internet as primarily kind of a commercial and personal network. So that's clearly going to be the last step, I think, for most countries. But, facilitating takedowns between countries or within countries. is another way that internationally we can try and manage this crisis. Having visible prosecutions showing that governments are actually going to apply the laws they have in place and put the time and effort into things like digital forensics and instant response to gather the evidence, to work on extradition treaties between countries, to show other offenders and potential offenders that there are consequences for their antisocial behaviour. I don't think any of those things that I've talked about there should be rocket science, but it is interesting to my mind just how few of these initiatives we see around the world. I kind of look forward to more discussions with governments, with business, to really try and work together to bring these kind of changes about. And really for them to work, because the internet is inherently international, then they need to be, I feel, to some extent, internationally consistent. But, countries themselves, at the end of the day, need to have policies and mechanisms to enforce those policies that are respectful of, culture and customs and laws. If the internet can't be regulated and controlled and can't be made subject to national laws, then is it actually a really good thing at the end of the day? So on that thought, I'm going to stop talking and stop sharing my screen and hand back to Professor Mohammed.
Thank you so much, Paul. It's really very, very interesting to see different angles of how to deal with it. So I'll open the floor first to questions from our audience. So Ahmed has a question.
Yep.
How to improve the investigation of malware-related crimes, especially in banking and social media?
Yeah, that's a great question, Ahmed, and thank you for posing it. Look, it definitely relates back to what I mentioned before. So, better investment in digital forensics and incident response at the national level. In our government's response to the Optus and Medibank data breaches, they've kind of, quite rightly, they've called the attackers scumbags and saying they're going to hold these scumbags to account. That sells newspapers, but it doesn't help gather the evidence that's necessary for successful prosecution. And so I think what you need from a policy point of view is a consistent set of expectations between ISPs and government around what data can be held and under what circumstances, and how can it be easily exchanged. And that is definitely a live issue here in policy making in Australia, because again, kind of sharing data which may have been leaked or breached itself may be a breach of the Privacy Act. So you end up in these circular arguments where people say, hey, I think I've got some information, but if I share it with the government, then maybe I'll get into trouble. So, we need to, I guess, make those obligations clear, make them actionable, and I think at a central level, provide that DF capability, because there are very, very few companies who have the resources and budget to have their own DFI capability in-house. In Australia, unless you're one of the large banks, you probably don't have your own cyber team, or if it is, it's probably relatively small. And once you drop out of our top 50 companies, the likelihood is, you're just not going to have very much capacity at all.
Right, yeah. So we have more questions. So there's a question from Mahfouz Rahman. He's asking about using machine learning methods. The behavior of various security incidents can be analyzed. But as the behavior changes over time, the characteristics of recent attacks and patterns are missing.
Yep.
So would you please comment on this?
Yep. I'm gonna make two comments about this. I'm gonna kind of, so that this might be where it's good to give the research view and then the commercial view, you know. And of course, the research view is, you know, I think to improve the accuracy of the classification techniques, you need to continuously gather and label new data, potentially in a semi-supervised environment. And, you know, that is something that potentially can be handled through a SOC, I think. And putting my commercial hat on, I'm going to say that all the AI machine learning in the world is great, but there's a reason that we have eyes on glass. And the reason is that, you know, I think humans are still probably the best at resolving those decision-making issues where you've got potential for high false positives, which are very, very costly in terms of responding to, but the potential for high false negatives as well, which can then have downstream consequences. So, you know, my kind of gut feeling overall for machine learning is that, you know, you want to use machine learning to cut through the volume and present to human decision makers those kind of anomalous situations which are not easily resolvable by the machine. But I think you raise a great point.
I have another question. It's a long one, so I'll read it to you. So the question says that the governments have they are taking actions, as you have said, and for instance, in the US, I think now ransomware attacks are treated as terrorism. So the coordinated, driven, intelligence-driven disruptions, they pinpoint the weaknesses in our infrastructure and organizations. Is there any offensive disruption measures to fight against ransomware attacks, for example, to interrupt digital payments or secure and recoup ransom paid by victims, like, for example, what happened in the pipeline ransomware attack in the US.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a great point, Professor Mohammed. And I think what the Bitcoin recovery by the FBI showed was that, you know, again, kind of coming back to Ahmed's point, you know, I think if you've got that capability there to do forensics across a whole range of devices and technologies and networks and application stacks, with enough time and effort, nothing is impossible. And so I think, you know, if governments invest in that kind of centralized capability and make it available in the event of an attack, you know, attribution, I mean, I guess if you're going to fight back, I mean, attribution is the immediate kind of issue. So, you know, unless, you know, the attackers have kindly turned on IPsec or something, you know, in all likelihood, they're going to be coordinating over Tor or, you know, some other kind of obfuscated VPN. But, you know, penetrating that kind of infrastructure, again, is not impossible. It just takes time and effort and money. And, you know, I think we are at the point where you look at it from a national security point of view, you say, what are the economic costs of doing nothing versus swallowing the costs to set up this capability properly? And I think the FBI, you know, clearly are in a better place in terms of funding than most countries. So, you know, you need to work out who you're going to attack. If you can do that, then have the capacity to kind of fight back. And I mean, I don't think that means fighting back by just, I don't know, launching a DDoS attack against the country of origin of the cybercrime gang. But, you know, it means being smart. It means following the money trail. It means going to those payment processes and saying, hey, we've just looked at the last 12 months of your weblog data, and we reckon that, I don't know, 100 million of what you processed is dirty, and we're going to seize it. You know, I think, you know, it's time to kind of take the kid gloves off and hit them where it hurts, which is basically the money.
So, any questions from our audience? You can raise your hand if you have any questions, or you can type them in the Q&A. So, one last very quick question, Paul. So, is cloud systems, are they more susceptible to ransomware attacks, or not? Is cloud helpful?
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, this is a great question, Mohammed. Thank you for raising it. I think I've got two perspectives on this. I mean, you know, you can imagine you get some, I don't know, I'm just imagining a scenario. You know, you've been ransomed, somehow miraculously the police go and raid someone's house and they find the hard drive on which your data is stored. And you know, but it has been encrypted using some kind of quantum cipher or a quantum computer, you know, and in terms of raw processing power required to decrypt such things, you know, the future looks pretty bleak, to be honest. I mean, unless you've got the kind of, you know, resources of the NSA or quantum computers yourself, it's going to be pretty hard. You know, on the other hand, if I'm an attacker, you know, and the communications channel has been secured by a quantum cipher, but at either end, it's still two PCs talking to each other, then I might be able to just transmit a malware payload across an incredibly confidential channel, in which case the quantum aspect really kind of doesn't provide you any particular advantage. So I think what I would say is that, you know, attackers will always try and look for the weakest link in the chain. And if we start beefing up things like the strength of ciphers, but we don't protect endpoints in terms of, you know, basic access control, for example, then, you know, to answer your question, yeah, we're probably not prepared for the future, but I suspect we're not really prepared for the present either.
Thank you so much, Paul. And I've just checked my mobile phone. Saudi Arabia is winning on Argentina. So that's good news. And I know it's very late in the evening in Australia. So I'd like to thank you on behalf of everyone in this talk, and on behalf of Birzeit University, who is co-hosting this event with us, on behalf of the Arab Association for Cybersecurity, and on behalf of the Prince Sultan University in Riyadh and the Data Science and Blockchain Lab at Prince Sultan. On behalf of everyone, I'd like to thank you, Paul, so much for being with us today, for talking to us about this very important topic. It's been a great talk, and you gave us so much insights into how to look at this from a national security perspective. Thank you so much, Paul, and I hope we will see you again in person, maybe in Saudi Arabia or in Australia again. I would absolutely love to come and visit you guys, and yeah, I hope to see you down under again, Professor Mohammed, sometime soon. Thank you so much, Paul. Thanks a lot. Thank you, everybody, for attending this talk, and we'll send an announcement about the next episode very soon. Thank you so much, Paul, again, and enjoy the rest of your evening. And good luck with the football, guys. Take care. Bye. Thanks a lot.